Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to All Saints Day in the Joyful Noise class. Kay and I would like to begin by thanking you for your prayers for our daughter Leanne during this past week and for other communications that you've made to her. She is a neighbor of the daughter of Joe and Janine Pennell, and their daughter Heather came by with some banana bread that not only Leanne and her husband enjoyed, but they shared with us as well. It made a nice breakfast treat. We had a wonderful time together last Sunday here as Bishop Joe led us in the lesson from Genesis on Abraham's sending his servant to find a bride for his son Isaac, his 40-year-old son Isaac. And the sharings that went on about Joe and Janine's courtship and marriage, and Rachel and Jim and Robert and Vicky and Bill and Maria, that created a rich experience last week in integrating that with the marriage of Isaac and his wife Rebecca. Our text this morning is, the core text is from Genesis 15, or excuse me, Genesis 25, and I'll be dipping into Genesis 26 for some material on Isaac that has escaped me a lot, and I think it's very helpful in looking at our core text. I'll begin with verse 19, and I'll be reading this and commenting on it in sections. These are the descendants of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel, the Araman of Paddan Aram, sister of Laban the Aramean. Isaac has traditionally been seen in the church as sort of a tweener. He's sort of a person that's a pale shadow between the dynamic Abraham and his son Jacob. But if we go to chapter 26 of Genesis, we see that he's much more than just a pale shadow of a man. In chapter 26, we learn that he settled in the southern part of what became the nation of Israel down toward the desert, and he migrated toward the Philistine area over by the Mediterranean coast. He became very wealthy, like his father Abraham, who was still living during the time that he grew in his business dealings. In fact, he became so successful that the Philistines and the Philistine king were greatly concerned about the growth of his wealth and power. And they asked him to retreat eastward so that he would not be a threat to them and their community. Another thing about Isaac that sometimes is overlooked is the fact that he and Rebekah had a great relationship in the early stages of their marriage. She was such a beautiful woman, just like his mother Sarah, that he did the same thing that his father did when they had gone down to Egypt. You recall that Abraham told the Pharaoh that this beautiful woman is my sister, so as to protect himself. They felt that if he had said, she's my wife, they might have killed him in order to bring her into the Egyptian harem. Well, the same thing happened with Isaac. Rebekah was so beautiful that he said to the people in the surrounding area, the Philistines, she's my sister. But it happened that the king saw Isaac and Rebekah in some caresses. And he knew that this was not a brotherly, sisterly kind of activity. And so he called Isaac to task and said, you know, you could have gotten us, some of our men, in trouble if they had taken her. They had a very high standard that they wouldn't take a woman that belonged to another man. And so Abimelech, the king, criticized Isaac for that. It was during this time that God spoke directly to Isaac, reiterating the covenant that he had given to his father. So Isaac didn't come just with second-hand knowledge of who he was and his being part of the covenant. The Lord told him that I'm going to give you this land. I'm going to multiply your offspring greatly, and through your offspring, I'm going to bless all nations. In effect, reiterating the Abrahamic covenant. As wonderful as Isaac and Rebekah's relationship was, and as wonderful as his economic situation was growing, there was a problem in this relationship. Rebekah, like her mother-in-law Sarah, was unable to bear children. And so we come to the next, or the continuation of our text for this morning. Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer, and his wife Rebekah conceived. The children struggled together within her, and she said, if this is the way it is to be, why should I live? So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. The one shall be the stronger than the other. The elder shall serve the younger. We see that both Isaac and Rebekah were people who relied on the Lord. Isaac, because recognizing that his wife was unable to bear children, prayed that she would be able to. And he did so faithfully over a period of 20 years. We see that finally when she became pregnant, the situation within her was of such great pain. The pain was of such great magnitude that she was discouraged, and she wondered what the meaning of it was. She inquired of the Lord. She went to him. She didn't just deal with her pain in isolation, but she looked to the Lord that she and her husband served and asked the Lord the meaning. And again, the Lord responded to her and told her that she was going to bear twins, and that these twins each would become the head of a great nation, and they would be divided. The nations that sprang from her sons would be against each other, and that one of the sons would be stronger than the other, and that the younger would be served by the older, which was very unusual in that culture. That situation where she was going to have children in conflict with each other reminded me of Super Bowl 47. Now you may think that's a strange connection. Do any of you remember Super Bowl 47?
Was that the year?
Pardon?
Was that the year?
No, that was not the year. It would have been 2013.
That was a Bud Light year, I think.
The Bud Light year.
The Mannings.
Not the Mannings going against each other, but a couple of young men who had the same mother went against each other, Jim and John Harbaugh. faced each other. Jim, the coach of the San Francisco 49ers, and John of the Ravens. And so the press preceding Super Bowl 47 hovered around Jackie Harbaugh, the mother of John and Jim, wanting to know, what do you think about this? And who are you going to be for? And I imagine that Jackie Harbaugh was torn greatly by this. As I remember it, she and her husband, Jack, viewed the game from the living room of their daughter in Indianapolis, and she didn't tip her hand as to who she favored. Jackie was a very strong woman. Jim Harbaugh, when he was in elementary school, in the gym class, irritated his gym teacher greatly by his competitiveness. And the gym teacher was so concerned, he went to the principal to tell him how competitive Jim Harbaugh was. And the principal met with Jackie and he said, "You need to put this boy on Ritalin." And Jackie said, "No way." She refused to have him put on Ritalin. And all of the teams that Jim played for and then coached subsequently were grateful that Jackie did not put Jim on Ritalin. So we come back to the birth. It's time for the birth of Rebekah's children. When her time to give birth was at hand, there were twins in her womb. First came out red, all his body like a hairy mantle, so they named him Esau. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand gripping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them, so it took 20 years for her to have these children. The first to enter the birth canal was this reddish boy covered with hair, a hairy mantle. And the name Esau was given to him, which is similar to a person being hairy or rough. The second child coming through the birth canal was grasping at the heel of his brother, the reddish boy, and they named him Jacob, whose name sounds similar to heel. Jacob also has the connotation of being someone who is a deceiver, someone who will betray persons, go behind their back to betray them, a person who is an opportunist. And so we see that there is conflict already in this family. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man living in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he was fond of game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. We see a lot here in just these two verses. Esau, a skillful hunter. He not only had the gifts of being able to be a hunter, but when it says that he was skillful, I think it implies that he worked very hard on becoming an excellent hunter, a man of the field. Esau, I checked a number of translations for this description of Esau, and one of the best ones is from the Spanish translation, the Reina Valera, where they call him un hombre del campo, a man of the field. And I think the hombre that Esau was, is better than any English description of him. Now, the description of Isaac, or rather Jacob, is that he's a quiet man. And I don't think that translation does adequacy to the Hebrew there. The Hebrew can mean that he was civilized or cultured, that he was a very careful man, a very detail-oriented man in what he did. And his living in tents did not mean that he was an inactive man. As wealthy as Isaac was, this was a sprawling estate of herds, flocks, silver and gold, and servants. There were many servants. And so probably early in his life, as he became a man, Jacob was likely put in charge of all of the pastoral part of the family business, taking care of the grazing of the animals and that kind of thing. So, and he was probably very good with the servants in being able to know which servants could do the best at various tasks. So Jacob was a highly skilled person, not just a quiet man. He was quiet, but he was highly skilled in his gifts. We come to the part where they have grown older. An interesting fact here before I look at that is that their grandfather, Abraham, was still living up until the time they were 15 years old. Now think about that. Abraham had come all the way from a place near the Persian Gulf called Ur. He had had a lifetime of rich experiences living in the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley as he migrated in a northwesterly direction. He had had a call from God to separate from his original family and to be the instrument through which God would bless the world. Probably these boys heard many stories from Abraham. I'm sure that they likely heard about the time that Abraham was called to take Isaac, their father, and sacrifice him. And you can imagine their eyes, how their eyes opened widely, became big as they heard some of these accounts. So the continuity between Abraham, Isaac, and the grandchildren, Esau and Jacob, were forged very strongly in those days. And those ties would be continue to be strong as Jacob imparted his understanding of the tradition to his 12 sons that would come much later. But now we come to the boys as they are older, probably in their 20s at this point. And so once Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field and he was famished. Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stuff, for I am famished." Therefore he was called Edom. Jacob said, "First, sell me your birthright." Esau said, "I'm about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Jacob was the kind of guy that was always looking ahead. The wheels of his mind were always in motion, looking for opportunities. And he had the insight to be able to take opportunities. I imagine being the second son, it bothered him a great deal to think that he would not have the birthright. Now let me pause at this point and speak of the two things that the oldest son in a family would receive: the birthright. So we'll have to go with our imaginations here. The birthright and the blessing. Those are the two prizes that the eldest son in a family received at that time. The birthright was an economic blessing. It was the fact that the elder would receive two portions for every portion that the younger received. So let's imagine in a family where there were 12 children, the assets would be divided 13 ways, and the oldest would receive 2/13. He would receive two portions, 2/13, and the younger, all the rest of them, the 11, would receive 1/13 of the assets. In this situation, the stakes were much higher because there were just two of them. So the assets would be divided 3 ways. Esau would have gotten 2/3 and Jacob 1/3. Jacob looks at Esau just focusing on this hunting business and being gone a lot of the time hunting, and probably he reasons to himself, I'm keeping this operation, I'm keeping Dad's operation going. I could handle this 2/3 better than he could. And so when he saw the opportunity, the starving or the famished Esau coming in from a hunting journey, he said, aha, I know what I'll do. It's likely that the situation that we have here is more like a military field kitchen. You know, later in the next generation, you have the children of Jacob taking the flocks to a remote place, and they would go from place to place finding the best pasturage. And it's likely that this was that kind of situation, and that they took office-like and field kitchen-like settings to go as the shepherds, the servants, took the flocks in different places. And so Jacob probably did not do the cooking of this red stuff himself, but when Esau came in hungry, he went to Jacob and said, I want some of that red stuff. The word famished here, that's translated famished, also has the connotation in Hebrew of being faint. It had been so long since he had had something to eat that he really felt that he was about to die. And so to him, looking at the birthright on one hand and this bowl of pottage on the other that would keep him alive, there was no question as to which was more valuable to him. And so he was willing to sell this birthright to his brother. Any observations that you would like to make about the characteristics of Isaac and Rebekah, or these twin sons that they have?
Jacob was a manipulator.
He was a manipulator. He was always looking for the weakness in other people so that he could take advantage of those weaknesses. Yes.
But was it sibling rivalry, probably?
It was definitely, and from the very beginning, in utero, you could feel the sibling rivalry. In fact, let me mention this about the Hebrew there. it speaks of them struggling with each other in the womb. This Hebrew word has a connotation of violent collision, crushing, breaking, and even the verb form indicates reciprocal blows between the children in utero.
She was in a lot of pain.
She definitely was in a lot of pain. So this conflict between the two boys started there, and their differences, the fact that they were so different, accentuated this conflict. Chip?
You know, this makes me think in my own life, how many times, no matter how large or how small, I have used the manipulation to get what I want. Well done. But here's the deal. Have I learned from this? Is there something that I've said, maybe because of what I received, I finally understood that this was not necessary. It can be little things, it can be big things. We've all had it. Well, okay, I've had it once, several times. And through this manipulation, have I drawn closer to a person that I want to be because of the regret instead of, oh boy, the reward.
Absolutely.
I don't know how to put it in words.
That's well said. And I think if you study the Jacob narrative from chapter 25 to 50, even if you just scan it and look for the storyline about Jacob, you're going to see exactly what you've described in yourself, that he learned a lot over the years. Yes, Mike?
Do we know what the outcome of both the boys were in the long run?
Yes, both of those outcomes are in Genesis, between Genesis 25 and Genesis 50. Of course, Jacob has 12 sons and a daughter. Esau has a huge number of children, and you'll recall, we won't deal with this in this series of lessons, but there is a time when they come together, and Esau brings 400 men to meet his brother Jacob. And what would that have done to Jacob, knowing that 400 men were coming with his brother? He was shaking in his boots. And he put together some pretty substantial offerings, financial and material offerings, to offer Esau. In the long run, the Lord blessed both Jacob and Esau. But Jacob would always be the one through whom God was working in the covenant way. And so next week, we'll be looking at the blessing, what's going to happen to the blessing. We see what happened to the birthright today, but next week, the blessing. Any other observation that you have on these boys or their parents? One of the things about the Jacob narrative, looking at the whole thing, is that the writers of Scripture do not airbrush what's going on here. Very often, I've read corporate histories or histories of various organizations, and everything is copacetic. Everything is light and just fine. But that's not the way the Bible is. The Bible is truthful. It is truthful in detail about our nature. And the marvelous thing is that God recognizing and being aware of all that we are, the unfinishedness and the perverseness even that we are, God loves us, and He is working through those rough spots in our life to refine them. And you see that exactly in Chip testified to that in his own life, and that's exactly what we see in the case of Jacob. Any other observation on this text? Thank you.